Hi everyone, and welcome to today's Digital Byte, breaking down the binary. My name is Sarah Wargen, and I work as a System Support Specialist at Northern Waters Library Service. This project is a collaboration with Sherry Machonis, Director of Northern Waters Library Service. Let's go ahead and jump right in. To begin the presentation, let's go ahead and discuss what pronouns are. Pronouns essentially are a way of using words in place of a proper name. So for example, instead of saying, oh, that's Emily over there, you could say, that's her over there, if you already are in a conversation with somebody and you know you're speaking about Emily. So you could say, oh, of course, that's her over there. I just saw her yesterday. She is a nice person. It's different ways of talking about people without using their specific name. So typically the pronouns you might be familiar with are she, her, and he, him. However, there are also pronouns such as they, them. And they, them pronouns are often, but not always, used by non-binary people. I will go over explaining what non-binary individuals are a little bit later into the presentation. But just know again that she, her, he, him, they, them pronouns are pretty common. There are also a combination of pronouns. For instance, some people who fall under the non-binary umbrella may use both she, her, and they, them pronouns, for instance. Fun fact with this as well, they, them pronouns have actually been in use within the English language for several centuries. So let's go ahead and talk about gender identity, gender expression, and a bit more. So to jump right into that, I have our handy dandy little gingerbread person here. And this is just kind of a visual to go over some important concepts that I will be talking about in a bit more depth throughout the presentation. So feel free to go ahead and just pause the video here if you would like to read more. And I will also have a link to this visual at the end of the presentation as well, so that you're able to examine it a little bit more if you would like. But some of the concepts that are mentioned here that I'll be going over are gender identity, your attraction, gender expression, and then biological sex. So to get us started, gender identity is your psychological sense of self. How do you see yourself within the world, and how do you self-identify? So for instance, you may be a man, you may be a woman, you may be a non-binary person, and so forth. But it is, again, how you kind of see yourself, how you go about expressing yourself in the world. And because it is your kind of internal sense of self, the way that you look might not necessarily represent your gender identity. So for instance, if somebody sees you and you have long hair, for instance, people might assume, oh, that's a woman, but you could identify as a non-binary individual and still have long hair. That would actually tie more into your gender expression, which I'll be getting into in just a moment. And if you don't identify as like a man or woman or a non-binary person, there are other ways of identifying as well. And I will be getting into those here with you shortly. So jumping right into gender expression, this is how you demonstrate who you are to the world. And how you present yourself to the world. This is done either through your clothing, through your action, through your general demeanor, and so forth. And then also how those presentations are viewed based on societal expectations. So for instance, you may express with having shorter hair, wearing more masculine clothing, wearing baseball caps and athletic shorts, for instance, and presenting yourself in a more masculine way to the world. The cool thing about gender expression, though, is that it can really change from day to day and from event to event. It doesn't necessarily need to be static, and it often isn't static. So for instance, you might express yourself and dress more femininely while you're at work. And then when you go home, you're a bit more androgynous. You kind of change out of that blouse and that pencil skirt, and you're wearing maybe your baseball cap and just a pair of kind of like grungy work shorts or something like that, and just being a little bit more androgynous when you're in the comfort of your own home. So as I kind of just touched on, there are a couple different types of gender expression out there, and this isn't a complete list, but you can express in more feminine ways, in more masculine ways, or in more androgynous ways, kind of a bit more gender neutral. Of course, you can also express with a blend of different ways. You might For instance, I tend to have very short hair. It's kind of buzzed on the side. And I would say I'm expressing myself in a more androgynous way with this button-up shirt. However, some days I do express in a more feminine way when it comes to my gender as well. So it can really just vary from person to person, day to day, and event to event. So moving right on through, we'll go over biological sex briefly. And these are the physical traits that you're born with, as well as the sex that you are assigned at birth. So that's typically going to be male or female. There are also intersex individuals as well. And these are people that are born with either like genitals or internal sex organs that don't match into kind of your standard male and female categories. So for instance, a person who has both ovarian and testicular tissues would be an intersex individual. And this is extremely commonly occurring in the United States. Approximately 1 in every 100 people born in the US is actually intersex. However, doctors do assign intersex babies a legal sex of male or female in most instances in most states. However, just like with non-intersex people, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's the gender identity that they will have growing up, because you can express your gender identity in whichever way best suits you. And biological sex, it's good to keep in mind that's more of a term that the medical community assigns you. It doesn't have to be something that sticks with you your whole life. So let's say you have more feminine genitalia. That doesn't necessarily mean that you need to go through life identifying as a woman, especially if that doesn't fit your internal sense of self and who you are. You may end up deciding I'm a transgender man, for instance. And moving right along, one concept I really just want to mention, because it's important, is that gender does not equal sexuality. Some of these terms have overlapping components at times, but who you are as your gender does not correlate to your sexuality per se. And I'll help to break this down here shortly with you. Attraction. So this is a concept I think most of us are familiar with. So this is either who you are emotionally and or sexually attracted to, or experience attraction in some other way to a person. So men who are attracted to women are typically going to identify as straight and vice versa. Men who are attracted to men may identify as gay. And then people who are attracted to 2 or more genders may identify as bisexual. And those are just a couple different sexualities out there. Obviously, that's not a complete list. There are other identity terms such as queer, which essentially just means that you're not straight. It, however, does not specify which gender or genders you're attracted to. So that's sort of an umbrella term when it comes to sexuality. There is pansexual, which means you are attracted to people despite gender, essentially. And that kind of takes us a little bit into gender. So again, breaking away from sexuality now and looking back at gender again. So most people who are born would be cisgender, and this means that you're comfortable identifying with the sex that you're assigned at birth. So for instance, you're born, the doctor lifts you up, goes, oh, yep, you're a girl based on your sexual organs and so forth. And if you're comfortable with that label that was given to you at birth, you grow up, you're now identifying as a woman, that means that you're cisgender. On the opposite side, the doctor saw you when you were born, said, yep, you're a boy, you grow up, you're a man now, and you're comfortable with that identity, again, you would be cisgender. However, transgender individuals, on the other hand, for them, their gender does not match with their sex assigned at birth. So for instance, people who are transgender women or transgender men would fall into this category. So for instance, if you were determined to be a boy at birth, however, you're expressing yourself in feminine ways, you're dressing in women's clothing and so forth, you might be a transgender woman. And moving along into the gender binary, this is essentially, think of the gender binary as a scale. So traditionally, within Western society, we have two options. At least this is what we were taught a lot of the time growing up. There's male on the one side of the spectrum and female on the other side of the spectrum. Sort of two distinct opposite forms. One side expresses femininity, one side expresses masculinity, and this is either set up through our social system or cultural beliefs, or both simultaneously, depending. And different societies have different views of the gender binary, and if there are other genders that fall into the spectrum. Again, a lot of the times that we're taught there's either male or female and that's it. However, that's not true. There are other genders, such as people under the non-binary umbrella, for instance. And essentially those who are non-binary, it means that they do not identify as either solely male or female. They may express themselves more androgynously. They may take on elements of femininity or masculinity. And again, that gender expression can change from day to day, so it doesn't need to be static per se. I think the important thing to remember is when you look at somebody, you can't necessarily assume their gender, which is why it's important to ask people their pronouns. So with this gender binary, again, we're kind of taught that there's two polarizing opposite sides of the binary. However, not everyone can fit so neatly into these categories that are set up for this. So if you're kind of outside of that binary, again, you might be a non-binary person, and there are so many other identities that can fall under that umbrella as well that I'll be getting into in the next slide. And as I kind of mentioned, there are some people who have a gender that blends like elements of being a man or a woman, or a gender that's entirely different from being either male or female. Under the non-binary umbrella, a couple of other identities that fall under that are genderqueer and agender, for instance, and I'll touch on those here. So here's our handy-dandy gender umbrella. So again, most people in society fall under this cisgender umbrella, so either cis women or cis men. However, there is also the transgender umbrella as a way to think about it and visualize it. Most people do fit under the gender binary. So even if you're a transgender individual, you're identifying with a binary gender, meaning like you're assigned male at birth. However, you now identify and live your life as a woman. It's still kind of within that binary system, so to speak. However, under the non-binary system, again, you just don't identify as either male or female, and it's the way that non-binary people express themselves. Again, it really varies from person to person, and the way they express themselves and present themselves to the world. They might look more feminine, more masculine, more androgynous, etc. However, it's just important to, again, keep in mind that they're outside of this binary and reject perhaps some of the traditional norms assigned to being either a woman or being a man. So other identities that could fall under kind of the non-binary category would be genderqueer, gender fluid, bigender, and agender. And if you are a bigender individual, these people identify with two genders, either simultaneously or will vary between the two. Genderqueer is kind of a similar term to non-binary, and people with this identity say they don't often relate to the experiences of either men or women. Gender fluid individuals do kind of fluctuate between identities, and it can kind of vary for them. And then agender individuals are people who feel that they don't have any sense of gender, or they don't have a gender at all, and so they just identify as agender. So this takes us right along into misgendering, and I think this can be kind of easy to do, especially if you don't know somebody's pronouns, and that's why it can be so important to ask somebody what their pronouns are when you meet them. However, you do ideally want to ask them in a more private setting, to just not out them in front of a group of people if they aren't out as a certain gender, for instance. So the main things to keep in mind here are try not to assume somebody's gender. Again, in private, ask somebody what pronouns that they like to use. And then I would say it's also extremely important to practice somebody's pronouns once you've learned what pronouns they use. And you want to practice both when that person's in the room and when they're not around as well. So for instance, if you meet somebody let's say their name is Theo, and Theo uses they, them pronouns, and you maybe haven't had much practice using they, them pronouns, go ahead and just practice using it when Theo is hanging out with you in that room. If you're talking about Theo with your other friends or your coworkers, you could say, oh yeah, I saw Theo yesterday. They helped me out with a project. They made sure that we got the spreadsheet done on time, for instance. However, if you accidentally misgender Theo and use like he, him pronouns, for instance, you know that that's not correct. Stop yourself. Try not to make too big of a deal and overly focus on it. But if you're misgendering that person when they're around or when they're not around, the important thing is to apologize to that person if they're in the room. Just quickly correct yourself, use the correct pronoun, and kind of move on from there. You want to keep the apology brief so that it doesn't become about you and your mistake, essentially. And then again, just keep practicing and really just make an effort to correctly use that person's pronouns. So there were a lot of resources that were used in making this presentation, which are on the references page right after this. However, if you're learning about some of these concepts for the first time, I've just pulled a couple of resources that might be useful to you to kind of learn more about gender, learn a little bit more about sexuality, perhaps. So GLSEN, for instance, is an organization that focuses on issues for LGBTQ plus students, kindergarten through age 12. So that's more of a school age resource, but could be important if you have children who are maybe realizing that they're transgender or that they're non-binary, for instance. And the Trevor Project is also kind of geared towards youth as well. They offer a 24/7 crisis support to young LGBTQ plus people. And they do also have a resources page on their website where you can learn more about LGBTQ plus topics. I still like to go to that website sometimes and read up on things. Read about gender identities I'm not as familiar with, for instance. And I also have a list of LGBTQ plus literature here for your reference. Again, kind of catered to a young adult audience, but there's so many other books and resources out there as well. Just a place to start if you're learning. And here's the reference page. So the gingerbread person graphic that I had early in the presentation is listed here, as well as the other resources that were used throughout the presentation. And feel free to go ahead and read these and check out some of these websites to learn a little bit more. And if you ever have any questions, of course, feel free to reach out to us. We would love to offer more support if we can and aid you in this educational learning process. Thanks so much for taking the time to watch this Digital Byte today, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Take care.